Hey everybody, today I'll be taking a look at three more family weight style board games here. The games are going to be The Quest for El Dorado, we have Vikings, and we're also going to take a look at Picture Perfect. Now before I get started on my thoughts on these games, I want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer when it comes to acquiring board games here in the UK. And if you use my link in the show notes or the QR code, then you can get 5% off your first order. Okay, so let's start here with The Quest for El Dorado. So this is a 2 to 4 player game that takes around an hour to play, at least according to the box, but personal experience, I've had many games that have run quicker than that. So this is a deck building and racing game hybrid, as you are trying to traverse this modular board here in order to reach El Dorado before the other players do. And as with deck building games, you are trying to manage your hands of cards, use them efficiently, and buy new ones from the market to get better and better as the game goes on. And all these cards are going to associate to these different terrains on the different hexes within the map here. So for example, in order to travel through this thick kind of bush here, you're going to have to use these machetes to cut your way through. And you're going to start with pretty basic cards, as with most deck builders, but you can invest in better and better ones to get faster and faster. And of course, you and the other players are sharing routes at times, so therefore you might be stood in the way, then you might have to go around you, and that kind of thing. So there's a good bit of tension here to try and get to places quicker than the other players do. Now, if you watch my content regularly, you might have noticed that I tend to not play many deck building games. I've always thought that there's a bit too much going on in them and you have to keep investing and getting more and more content to keep it interesting. And that kind of style of model, or that buying model, doesn't interest me too much. But and that kind of ties into my initial thoughts of this one, because when I first played this one, I was a little bit underwhelmed because I wasn't quite sure what to expect, and it turned out to be, a very family-friendly, accessible game. And I thought, maybe I wanted a bit more meat on the bones here, more things to explore. But when I knew what I was getting into and I accepted that's what the game was and that's what it was trying to be, I've tended to enjoy it more and more. And I especially think a big part of that is because it does not outstay its welcome at all. You want race games to be relatively punchy and relatively quick to bring out that feeling of the race. And I think this game does that well. You have to accept that there is some swinginess in the luck here. Like, for example, I've had many games of this where I'm stuck on a certain spot. I just need a single card to let me get past this water, and I don't draw it for several turns while my other opponents are flying through the map because they've drawn the right cards at the right times. Now, generally that'll balance out, but sometimes you're too far behind and you can't make up the ground. But you have to, again, be prepared to roll with those punches and accept that that might play a part. And the more I've accepted that, the more and more I've enjoyed it. So this has actually climbed to the front of my favourite deck building style games because it's all self-contained. You don't need to keep buying new stuff. And it's like a nice little charming design here by the good Dr. Rainer Knizia. So I actually think for a gateway deck building racing game hybrid, this is a really cool option, and it's a game that I don't really ever feel like turning down. I might not always request it, but I always have a good time when it gets to the actual table. So that is The Quest for El Dorado. The next game we're talking about here is Picture Perfect. Now this is a 2 to 4 player game that takes around 45 minutes to play. Now if you watched my 2022 Chairman's Choice Awards, you might be aware that this game won the category for the most unique game of the year. Because the concept of this game is absolutely fascinating, as each player has their own basic little diorama here centered around this dining table, and you're going to have a bunch of these different character standees. And the idea is that you want to be taking the perfect group photograph based on the wants and needs of all these characters. Because at the start of the game, each of these characters is going to have their own little personal sleeve here. And you're going to randomly distribute these cards into those sleeves, which will show what those characters want. So for example, this character might say, well, I want to be stood next to this gentleman, and I want to be stood next to the table. Some might say, I want to be stood away from the table, or I want to be stood behind the table, or I want this character's face to be covered up. And all these different things you're trying to map out to try and reach as many of them as possible to get the most points. So a very cool, unique concept, which has to be given full props because, generally speaking, most mechanisms and ideas in board games are rehashed now because there are so many games coming out. This game managed to break through and try something completely different, which gets my full respect. I like this idea of the memory in the game because, generally speaking, I don't have a great memory. I don't find memorizing things particularly fun, but this game manages to make it fun, which is a bit of an anomaly for me. And I think a big part of that is because of the real tangible nature of the game, and because each of the characters are quite distinct and unique, so they do have a good caricature, and that can help you, retain information a bit better. So I do like that, because you only have a small fraction of the information available to you at any time, and once it goes on to the next round, you're going to have to remember what these characters wanted. You can regain that information back, but generally that's not going to happen. Now, despite me loving the concept of this game and finding it a lot of fun, I do think this game has a lot of rough edges. I think there's certainly some things that could have been ironed out in terms of the design process. Like, for example, because of the cards being distributed at the beginning of the game randomly, sometimes their wants and needs are contradicting with each other. So some might say, well, I want to be stood next to the table, but in the same sleeve you have one that says I want to be stood away from the table, which obviously can't happen. So you're going to have to give up one, so you can't score maximum points. Now that's a small criticism. But I also think that there were a few too many mechanisms added into the design process. Like, for example, each round there's an event. Most of those events are really simple, like swapping sleeves with each other, that kind of thing. But sometimes they add in this auction mechanism where you are spending these items on your table to bid for information. I think that is completely extra. It did not need to be there. It did not help with the game experience at all. It made it fiddly and convoluted for the sake of it. So I definitely think I would remove that part of the game completely. And when I personally play this game, we always take those events out of the deck, because again, it's too much for this style of gameplay and it takes away from the core experience. But on top of that, I think the game is great. It's a really good, fun experience. And, I thought it would run dry pretty quickly, but it didn't. And I really enjoyed this one still. So that's picture perfect. A fantastic little family game here. And the final game I'm talking about today is Vikings by Michael Kiesling. So this is an older game, takes around an hour to play, accommodates 2 to 4 players, and it's a tile placement drafting style game, as you are drafting these tiles, which are these different islands, I suppose, and putting them on your own little player board here, which is essentially this little axes, and you have to build them from left to right. And also, when you draft these tiles from this really cool kind of bidding wheel here, they go hand in hand with a particular meeple colour, and all these different little Viking meeples have their own strengths and have to go in these particular rows on the islands on your player board. So, for example, the black Viking meeples will help fight off these ships that come and attack you, and if you fight them off successfully, then you can get victory points or you can get more income. You've got the red ones here, which give you straight up victory points. You've got the green ones, which will give you points based on the ones below it. You have the yellow ones, which will give you more income during the income phases. And you have the blue ones, which will give you basically the ability to feed your workers at the end of the game, because if you don't focus on that, you're going to end up risking losing a lot of points. I love the fact that when you draft these things, they go hand in hand with each other. And if you can't place them immediately, they go straight into the storage area, meaning that you have to collect these grey meeples, these grey Vikings, to ship them off to the islands later. So you want to be efficient there. And if you're not being too efficient, you want to be making sure you're investing in these grey kind of boatsmen here, these boatsmen, which is a really cool mechanism. I like the way that the wheel here rotates based on what other people are taking. So, for example, if there's only, say, one type of meeple available, like you're desperate for a black meeple to fight off this threat, then you're going to have to spend a fair amount of money to do so. But the more and more these cheaper tiles get bought up, as soon as a new one becomes the cheapest one, this will rotate around, making everything else cheaper. So it does have that kind of passive play interaction there, and it's certainly another wrinkle to the game that you need to consider, because money in this game is super tight. Just a very cohesive game here. I love the way everything works. I love that, again, that dual drafting mechanism. I like the way you're compensated by spending the most money, because if you spend more money than anybody else at any time, you get to take one of these bonus tiles, which are really useful tools, which will kind of increase the yield of your certain Vikings, etc. Just a wonderful game. I talk kind of ad nauseum, really, about games being out of print and why that's a shame. I think if I was to ask for a game to be reprinted, I think Vikings might be right at the top of that totem pole, because I think with the right kind of release and the right marketing, this game could be as big as a game like Cascadia. I think this game's a better game than Cascadia, and I really like that game. But yeah, for some reason this game isn't being played, it's not out there readily available, and it should be, because it ticks so many boxes and it appeals to so many different people. I could teach this to somebody who's relatively new to gaming and they'd have a great time, or I could play this one with 3 other really salty experienced kind of Eurogamers, and they're also going to have a really good time with it because the game experience is that rich and it is that enjoyable without being complicated, without being confusing or anything like that at all. And that kind of different dynamic in terms of the tile placement is different to anything else out there, because you can't just put things where you want. You have to construct these islands in particular orientations, and depending on the availability of these tiles, that is really going to change the flow of the gameplay. So this one is going from strength to strength for me personally. You know, this was kind of creeping into the bottom of my top 100, but the more I play it, it's getting higher and higher on that list, and I think it might even be breaching the top 50 now. So that's how much I think of this relatively simple tile placement game. Just an absolute delight to play. And this one, if you find a copy out there in the wild, I really advocate you pick this one up because it is an absolute gem of a game. So that is Vikings. So there we have it. That's my thoughts on these 3 games. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please hit like and subscribe to my channel. And for everybody else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye-bye.